The restoration studio in downtown Philadelphia smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, scents that Sarah Chen had grown to associate with revelation. As an art conservator specializing in 19th-century American portraiture, she had seen her share of damaged paintings emerge from centuries of grime and neglect to reveal forgotten faces, hidden details, and occasionally unsettling truths. But nothing in her 15 years of experience had prepared her for what she was about to uncover in the Beckett family portrait. The painting had arrived at her studio on a cold November morning in 2019, delivered by an estate attorney named Marcus Whitmore. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen too many family secrets spill out during probate proceedings. The portrait, he explained, had been discovered in the basement of the old Beckett estate in rural Pennsylvania, wrapped in moth-eaten canvas and forgotten for over a century. Sarah carefully unwrapped the painting in her climate-controlled workspace, her trained eyes immediately assessing the damage. The canvas was warped, the varnish had darkened to an amber haze, and there were several tears along the edges. But beneath the deterioration, she could make out the ghostly outlines of 5 figures, a family frozen in time. The estate wants it restored for auction, Whitmore said, handing her a file folder. Everything we know about the Becketts is in here. Not much, I'm afraid. The family disappeared in 1867 under mysterious circumstances. The house stood empty for decades before distant relatives claimed it. This portrait is one of the few artifacts that survived. Sarah opened the folder after Whitmore left, scanning the sparse documentation. The Beckett family consisted of patriarch Edmund Beckett, age 42, his wife Catherine, 38, and their 3 children, Margaret, 16, Thomas, 14, and little Emma, just 7 years old. They lived on a prosperous farm outside the town of Ashford, Pennsylvania, a community of about 300 souls in the post-Civil War era. According to a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Ashford Gazette dated October 1867, the entire family vanished overnight, leaving behind a house with food still on the table and livestock unfed in the barn. The article quoted the local sheriff, a man named Horace Brennan, who declared the disappearance baffling. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, and no witnesses. The community searched for weeks, dragging ponds and combing the surrounding woods, but not a trace of the Becketts was ever found. The case remained unsolved, eventually fading into local legend, whispered about in taverns, and used to frighten children into good behavior. Sarah began the restoration process methodically, as she always did. First came the cleaning, using carefully mixed solvents to remove layers of yellowed varnish and accumulated grime. As the first layer came away, the colors beneath began to emerge, rich burgundies and deep forest greens, the warm glow of lamplight captured in oil paint. But it was the faces that held her attention. Edmund Beckett stared out from the canvas with intense dark eyes, his bearded face stern and unyielding. He stood behind his seated wife, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Catherine Beckett was a handsome woman, with auburn hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the tightness around her mouth, a tension that suggested swallowed words and suppressed emotions. The children were arranged around them, Margaret standing to her mother's right, Thomas to the left, and little Emma seated at her mother's feet. As Sarah worked through the following days, carefully removing century-old varnish and gently mending tears in the canvas, she began to notice something peculiar. The more she cleaned, the more the faces seemed to shift. At first, she attributed it to the changing quality of light in her studio, the way autumn sun gave way to grey November skies. But the sensation persisted. The family members, who had initially appeared to be looking in slightly different directions, as was common in formal portraits, now seemed to be turning, slowly, incrementally, toward the viewer. She mentioned it to her assistant, a young graduate student named Michael Torres, who laughed and suggested she was working too many late nights. But when he looked at the portrait himself, his smile faded. "There is something off about it," he admitted. "The way they're looking at us, it's like they're aware we're here." Sarah tried to shake off the unease. She was a scientist, trained in chemistry and art history, not given to flights of fancy. Yet every morning when she returned to the studio, the portrait seemed different, more confrontational. The eyes followed her as she moved around the room. She began to dream about the Becketts, vivid nightmares where they stood in a darkened farmhouse, their mouths moving silently, trying to tell her something she couldn't hear. 3 weeks into the restoration, Sarah found the first hidden element. While examining the painting under ultraviolet light to check for previous restoration attempts, she noticed something beneath the surface, a pentimento, artists called it, an underlying image that had been painted over. Using a microscope and careful analysis, she discovered that the original composition had been different. The family had not been alone in the portrait. There had been a sixth figure, standing in the shadows behind them, barely visible but undeniably present. Someone had deliberately painted over this figure, carefully matching the background colors to erase all evidence of their existence. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Who had been removed from the portrait, and why? She increased the magnification, studying the ghost image. The figure was tall, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing, but the face had been completely obliterated, scraped away with such violence that the canvas itself was damaged. That evening, unable to sleep, Sarah drove out to Ashford, Pennsylvania. The town was 2 hours west of Philadelphia, nestled in rolling farmland that had changed little in the past century and a half. The modern world had touched Ashford lightly, a few chain stores on the highway, satellite dishes on old farmhouses. But the town centre still clustered around a white-painted church and a brick courthouse that dated to the 1840s. The Ashford Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian home on Main Street. Sarah arrived just before closing time and was greeted by the director, an elderly woman named Dorothy Walsh, who had lived in Ashford her entire life. When Sarah mentioned the Beckett family, Dorothy's expression changed. A mixture of interest and something else, wariness perhaps, or fear. "The Becketts," Dorothy said slowly, leading Sarah to a back room lined with filing cabinets and glass display cases. "Yes, we have materials on them. It's one of our town's great mysteries, though not one we advertise to tourists. People prefer cheerful history, barn raisings, and harvest festivals. They don't like to think about the darkness that can lurk in small communities." She pulled out a cardboard box labeled Beckett Family, 1850-1867, and set it on a scarred wooden table. Inside were documents, letters, property deeds, and more newspaper clippings. Sarah spent 2 hours reading through everything, taking notes on her phone, her unease growing with each revelation. The Becketts had not been a happy family, despite their prosperity. Edmund was a harsh man, known for his temper and his rigid control over his household. Several letters from Catherine to her sister in Pittsburgh spoke of her isolation and fear, veiled references to punishments and locked doors. The children were rarely seen in town, homeschooled and kept close to the farm. Neighbors whispered about screams heard at night, unexplained injuries, and the family's increasingly strange behavior in the months before they vanished. But it was the final document that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a letter dated October 15, 1867, just days before the disappearance, written in a childish hand. "Dear Sheriff Brennan," it began, "please help us. Father has gone mad. He keeps us locked in the cellar when he goes into town. He says we are tainted, that we must be purified. Mother tried to run away with us last week, but he caught us. He hurt her badly. We are so afraid. Please come." The letter was unsigned, but Sarah guessed it had been written by one of the older children, Margaret or Thomas. "Did the sheriff ever receive this?" Sarah asked Dorothy. Dorothy shook her head. It was found years later, tucked into the back of a book donated to the Historical Society. We don't know if the child who wrote it ever managed to send it, or if Edmund intercepted it, but it changes everything we thought we knew about the disappearance, doesn't it? This wasn't a family that simply vanished. Something terrible happened in that house. Sarah drove back to Philadelphia through the darkness, her mind racing. The portrait took on new meaning now. This was not just a family frozen in time, it was a record of captivity, of suffering hidden beneath formal clothes and rigid poses. And the sixth figure, the one someone had violently erased from the painting, who were they? An accomplice? A witness? Or perhaps the person responsible for what happened to the Becketts? When she returned to her studio the next morning, Sarah found the portrait had changed again. All 5 family members were now staring directly forward, their eyes fixed on whoever stood before the canvas. And for the first time, she noticed their expressions. Edmund's stern face held not authority, but desperation. Catherine's tight mouth seemed to tremble on the edge of a scream. The children's eyes were wide with terror. They were not looking at the viewer with curiosity or dignity. They were pleading, begging to be seen, to be heard, to be saved. Sarah understood then that restoring this painting meant more than repairing damaged canvas and bringing back faded colors. It meant uncovering a truth that had been deliberately hidden for over 150 years. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase evidence, to paint over the sixth figure, to let the Beckett family disappear into obscurity. But Sarah was determined to bring them back into the light, to discover what really happened in that Pennsylvania farmhouse in the autumn of 1867. She began to research with renewed intensity, diving into county records, census data, and court documents. She contacted historians specializing in the post-Civil War era, asked questions about the social dynamics of rural Pennsylvania communities, and studied cases of similar disappearances. And slowly, piece by piece, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, freedom, and the terrible secrets that communities can keep. The deeper Sarah delved into the Beckett family history, the more the comfortable narrative of a simple disappearance unraveled into something far more sinister. The county courthouse in Ashford proved to be a treasure trove of information, its basement archives filled with leather-bound ledgers and yellowing documents that chronicled the daily transactions of a small farming community in the years following the Civil War. Sarah spent her weekends making the drive to Ashford, always arriving early when the courthouse opened, working until the clerks gently reminded her at closing time that they needed to lock up. She hired Michael, her assistant, to help photograph documents and organize the growing database of information they were compiling. What emerged was a picture of the Beckett family that was far more complex and troubling than the sparse historical record suggested. Edmund Beckett had not always been a farmer. Before settling in Ashford, he had been a surgeon in the Union Army, serving at several field hospitals during the Civil War's bloodiest battles, Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness Campaign. His military records, which Sarah obtained through a historian friend at the National Archives, showed a man who had witnessed unspeakable carnage. The terse medical reports he filed documented hundreds of amputations, traumatic injuries, and deaths. By the war's end, something in Edmund had broken. He returned to Pennsylvania in 1865 with his wife Catherine and their children, purchasing a large farm on the outskirts of Ashford with money he had inherited from his father's estate. The farm was isolated, set back nearly a mile from the main road, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. It was as if Edmund was deliberately choosing seclusion, placing himself and his family as far from society as possible. The townspeople of Ashford initially welcomed the Becketts. Edmund was educated, Catherine was refined, and their children seemed well-mannered during their infrequent appearances in town. But gradually, the family withdrew. They stopped attending church services. The children no longer came to the town school. When Catherine did venture into the general store for supplies, neighbors noted her gaunt appearance and the way she flinched at sudden movements. Sarah found a series of entries in a diary kept by the store owner's wife, a woman named Harriet Gunderson. The entries from 1866 and early 1867 documented growing concerns about the Becketts. November 1866. Saw Mrs. Beckett today. She had a terrible bruise on her wrist, claimed she fell while carrying firewood. January 1867. The Beckett girl. Margaret came in alone, bought flour and salt pork, would not meet my eyes when I asked after her mother. April 1867. Mrs. Beckett, weeping in the store, composed herself quickly when I approached, purchased laudanum and bandages, would not say why she needed so much. But the most chilling entry came from July 1867. Just 3 months before the disappearance, young Thomas Beckett appeared at our back door after midnight, begging for help, said his father had locked them all in the root cellar as punishment for some imagined transgression, had been down there for 2 days without food. My husband took the boy home the next morning. Mr. Beckett thanked him politely, gave no explanation. Thomas looked terrified to be returned to that house. Sarah also discovered something else in the courthouse archives, property records showing that Edmund had made extensive renovations to the farmhouse shortly after purchasing it. He had hired local contractors to dig a large cellar beneath the house, much deeper than necessary for food storage, and to reinforce the foundation walls with thick stone. The contractors noted in their invoices that Edmund had insisted on heavy doors with exterior locks, unusual for a cellar, and had personally supervised the installation of iron rings set into the stone walls. One of the contractors, a man named Joseph Miller, had written a letter to his brother describing the work. "The doctor is building himself quite the fortress," Miller wrote. "Says he wants the cellar for storing preserves and vegetables through winter, but I have never seen a root cellar that needs doors that could hold back a mob or walls thick enough for a bank vault, truth be told. It gave me an uneasy feeling, working down there in the dark with him watching. He has the look of a man who has seen too much death and learned to feel nothing from it." The renovation records were dated to fall and winter of 1865, the same period when Edmund was supposedly recovering from his war service. Sarah began to form a hypothesis. Edmund had returned from the war deeply traumatized, possibly suffering from what would not be diagnosed for another century as post-traumatic stress disorder. His experiences on the battlefield had warped his mind, filling him with paranoia and a desperate need for control. The fortress cellar was not for food storage. It was a prison. Sarah shared her findings with Dorothy Walsh at the Historical Society, and together they began to search for any information about the sheriff who had investigated the disappearance, Horace Brennan. They found his reports in the county archives, handwritten accounts of the search for the Becketts that revealed more questions than answers. Sheriff Brennan had been thorough. He had organized search parties, interviewed neighbors, and examined the Beckett farmhouse carefully. His report described finding the house in perfect order, almost unnaturally so. The beds were made, dishes were washed and put away, clothing was folded in drawers. The livestock had been released from the barn and were wandering the property. In the parlor, he found the family portrait that would eventually make its way to Sarah's studio, hanging above the fireplace. But Brennan had also found something else, something that troubled him deeply. In the cellar, the heavy-doored, stone-walled cellar that Edmund had built, Brennan discovered signs of recent habitation. There were blankets on the floor, empty water buckets, and scratches on the stone walls, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by fingernails. Brennan noted in his report, "Evidence suggests the family may have been confined to the cellar for some period before their disappearance. Purpose unknown. No signs of violence, but the scratches on the walls and the bent spoons found near the door suggest attempts to escape or dig through the walls. The sheriff had questioned neighbors about Edmund's state of mind. Several mentioned that in the weeks before the disappearance, Edmund had been seen in town talking to himself, making purchases of rope, chains, and padlocks. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Harding, reported that Edmund had come to him seeking spiritual counsel, speaking of demons and purification, of keeping evil contained. The Reverend, in his statement to Brennan, said, "I fear Mr. Beckett's mind has been shattered by the war." He spoke of visions and voices, of a great darkness that followed him home from the battlefield. When I suggested he seek medical treatment and allow his family some respite from his increasingly erratic behavior, he became enraged and left. That was the last time anyone in town saw him or his family. Sarah found one more crucial piece of evidence in the archives, a newspaper article from a Pittsburgh paper dated December 1867, 2 months after the Becketts vanished. The article reported that a severely injured man had been found wandering near the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, delirious and unable to identify himself. He had been taken to a charity hospital where he died 2 days later from exposure and injuries consistent with a violent beating. The man had been wearing the remnants of what appeared to be good quality clothing and had a distinctive pocket watch inscribed with the initials E.B. Sarah felt her heart racing as she read the description. The watch had been sold at auction by the hospital to cover burial costs, and its current whereabouts were unknown, but the description matched perfectly with a watch Edmund Beckett had been noted as carrying in earlier documents, a gold timepiece inherited from his father. Could this unidentified man have been Edmund? If so, what had happened to him? And more importantly, what had happened to Catherine and the children? Sarah returned to her studio with a growing sense of dread. She continued working on the portrait, now using advanced imaging technology to further examine the painted-over sixth figure. Through infrared reflectography, she was finally able to see clearly what had been hidden. The sixth figure was not standing behind the family, as she had first thought. The figure was standing in the doorway of the room, blocking the exit, and in their hand was what appeared to be a long object, possibly a rifle or walking stick. But the most shocking discovery came when she examined the family's expressions again under magnification. What she had interpreted as formal rigidity was actually something else entirely. The family was not posing willingly. Their mouths were set in tight lines, not from somber dignity but from fear. Their eyes held not serenity, but terror barely contained. And when Sarah looked very closely at little Emma, seated at her mother's feet, she could see something she had missed before, tears, tiny painted tears running down the child's face. This was not a family portrait in the traditional sense. This was a document of captivity, painted under duress, perhaps at Edmund's insistence. And the sixth figure that had been so violently erased from the painting was the key to everything. Sarah became obsessed with identifying this person. She went back through all the documents, looking for anyone who had been close to the Beckett family, who might have visited their isolated farm, who might have been present when the portrait was painted. The painter's signature was illegible, worn away by time and the deterioration of the canvas. But Sarah found a receipt in the Beckett family papers, dated August 1867, just 2 months before they vanished. It was payment to a traveling portrait painter named Silas Cobb, $10 for services rendered. Sarah began searching for information about Cobb, and what she found chilled her. Silas Cobb was not just a painter. He was a former Confederate soldier who had deserted near the end of the war and made his way north, taking on various odd jobs to survive. Several wartime documents suggested he'd been involved in activities far darker than ordinary military service, interrogations, prisoner management, and enforcing discipline among troops. After the war, he had drifted through Pennsylvania and Ohio, sometimes painting portraits, sometimes working as a hired hand, and occasionally disappearing for months at a time. According to newspaper reports, Cobb himself had vanished in late October 1867, around the same time as the Becketts. His landlady in a town 30 miles from Ashford reported that he had left suddenly in the night, owing 2 weeks' rent, leaving behind his painting supplies and a trunk of belongings. When authorities searched his room, they found sketches, dozens of sketches of the Beckett family in various poses, and something else that made Sarah's blood run cold when she read about it in the police report: a detailed map of the Beckett farm, including the layout of the house and the location of the cellar. Sarah realized that the story was far more complex than a simple case of a disturbed man harming his family. There had been another player in this tragedy, someone who had not only witnessed what was happening in that isolated farmhouse, but had perhaps participated in it, had perhaps even orchestrated it. The violently erased figure in the portrait was Silas Cobb, and someone had gone to great lengths to remove him from the historical record. But who had painted him out, and why? Sarah examined the technique used to cover Cobb's image. It was skilled work, done by someone who understood painting and color mixing. The brushwork was confident, the color matching nearly perfect. This was not the work of an amateur trying to clumsily hide something. This was deliberate, professional erasure. Sarah spent days analyzing the paint used to cover Cobb's figure, using spectroscopy to identify its chemical composition. What she found was startling. The paint was different from the rest of the portrait. It contained pigments that had not been available until the late 1860s, possibly even early 1870s. This meant the erasure had happened after the portrait was originally painted, perhaps years after the Beckett family disappeared. Someone had kept this portrait, had waited, and then had systematically removed Silas Cobb from the image, erasing his presence from the family's history. Sarah was now certain that discovering what happened to the Becketts meant understanding who Cobb was and what role he played in their final days. The truth was buried in that portrait, hidden beneath layers of paint and time, waiting for someone persistent enough to uncover it. As Sarah worked late into the night, carefully documenting every detail of her restoration, she could not shake the feeling that the faces in the portrait were watching her with increasing intensity, as if they knew she was getting close to the truth, as if they were silently urging her forward, desperate for someone to finally understand what had been done to them in that isolated farmhouse in the autumn of 1867, and desperate for someone to finally give them justice. Sarah's investigation took a darker turn when she decided to visit the actual Beckett farmhouse. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, and the current owner, a retired couple named the Hendersons, had purchased it 5 years earlier, with plans to convert it into a bed and breakfast. Those plans had stalled, they told Sarah over the phone, because of what they kept finding during renovations. The drive out to the farm took Sarah through increasingly remote countryside. The November landscape was bleak, bare trees standing like skeletal sentinels against grey skies, fields harvested and empty, preparing for winter's grip. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a 2-story structure of weathered grey wood with a sagging front porch and windows that stared out like empty eyes. Even in daylight, the place radiated a sense of abandonment and sorrow. Ellen Henderson met Sarah at the door, a trim woman in her 60s with worried eyes and a forced smile. "My husband Paul is in town getting supplies," she said, leading Sarah inside. "I'm glad you called. We've been trying to understand the history of this place, and what you told me on the phone about your research, well, it explains some things. The interior of the house had been partially renovated. New drywall covered some walls, while others remained exposed, showing the original plaster and wooden laths beneath." Ellen led Sarah through rooms that still bore traces of their 19th century origins: wide pine floorboards, deep windowsills, a massive stone fireplace, but there was something oppressive about the atmosphere, a heaviness that Sarah could feel pressing down on her. "The cellar is what stopped us from moving forward," Ellen explained, opening a door off the kitchen to reveal a steep wooden staircase descending into darkness. "We were going to renovate it for storage, maybe a wine cellar. But Paul and I both felt uncomfortable down there from the first day, and then we started finding things." Sarah followed Ellen down the stairs, her hand gripping the rough wooden railing. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, and a damp, earthy smell filled her nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, Ellen switched on a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the stone walls that Edmund Beckett had ordered built over a century and a half ago. The cellar was larger than Sarah had expected, roughly 20 feet square, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. The walls were thick stone, expertly laid, and the floor was hard-packed earth. Heavy wooden beams supported the floor above. But what drew Sarah's attention immediately were the iron rings set into the walls, 6 of them at various heights, rusted now, but still solidly embedded in the mortar between stones. Ellen pointed to deep scratches in the stone walls, the same scratches Sheriff Brennan had noted in his report. But there were other marks Sarah had not read about, names and dates carved into the stone, desperate messages left by the imprisoned. In one corner, she could make out the words, "Help us," in rough letters, and nearby, "Mother is sick. Please God, let someone find us." The handwriting was that of a child, probably Thomas, based on the crude formation of the letters. "We found other things too," Ellen said quietly, pulling a cardboard box from a shelf. "We've been collecting them as we renovate. Thought maybe the Historical Society would want them." Inside the box were heartbreaking artifacts: a child's rag doll, mildewed and rotting, a tin cup with a bent handle, several buttons from clothing, a small leather-bound journal with water-damaged pages, and something that made Sarah's breath catch, a locket on a tarnished chain. She opened it carefully and found 2 tiny portraits inside, a man and a woman, clearly Catherine and Edmund Beckett from happier times. Ellen handed Sarah the journal. "It's Catherine's," she said. "We've tried to read it, but most of the pages are stuck together from water damage. What we could make out, well, it's disturbing." Sarah gently separated the pages of the journal, her conservator's training allowing her to handle the fragile paper without causing further damage. The entries were written in a feminine hand, the ink faded but still legible in places. She read fragments that painted a horrifying picture of the family's final months. May 1867. Edmund grows worse daily. He speaks of contamination and purification, of keeping us safe from the corruption of the outside world. He has forbidden the children from leaving the property. I fear for their well-being and my own. June 1867. He has begun locking us in the cellar when he goes into town. Says it is for our protection, that there are forces seeking to destroy us. The children cry, but he will not listen to my pleas. I have hidden this journal where he cannot find it. It may be the only record of what is happening to us. August 1867. The painter has come, a man named Cobb, who Edmund met in town. There is something wrong with this man. He looks at us with cold eyes and speaks to Edmund in whispers I cannot hear. Edmund insists we sit for a portrait. Cobb watches us constantly while he works. I see understanding in his eyes. He knows we are prisoners, but he does nothing. He and Edmund have become conspirators in something I do not understand. September 1867. It is worse now. Edmund and Cobb spend hours together locked in Edmund's study. I have heard them speaking of experiments and necessary measures. Cobb has moved into the house. Edmund says he is staying to help with preparations for what is coming. The children are terrified. Margaret tried to run away last week, but they caught her. I no longer believe we will survive this. The journal ended there. The remaining pages were too damaged to read, dissolved into an illegible mass by water and time. Sarah felt sick. This was not just a case of a war-traumatized man losing his sanity and harming his family. This was something organized, deliberate, involving two men with their own dark purposes. Sarah spent the next hour photographing every inch of the cellar, documenting the scratches, the iron rings, the messages carved into stone. Ellen showed her other areas of the house where they had found disturbing evidence, stains on floorboards that might have been blood, more scratches on the inside of closet doors, marks that suggested people had been locked inside. Paul Henderson arrived home while Sarah was finishing her documentation. He was a solid man with weathered hands and a direct manner. He listened as Ellen explained what Sarah had discovered, and his expression grew grave. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "Saw things that still wake me up at night. But there's something about this house that frightens me in a different way. It's not just what happened here, it's the feeling that whatever evil was in those men, it somehow soaked into the walls and never left." Sarah asked if she could see Edmund's study. Paul led her upstairs to a small room at the back of the house with a single window overlooking the woods. The room had not been renovated, its walls still covered in peeling wallpaper patterned with roses. A brick chimney occupied one wall, and built into the wall beside it was a small cupboard. "We found this hidden behind the wallpaper," Paul said, opening the cupboard to reveal a shallow space about 2 feet square. Inside was empty, but Sarah could see that something had been stored there, the outline of books or ledgers visible in the dust. Sarah examined the space carefully with her flashlight. At the back of the cupboard, she noticed something, a loose brick. She carefully worked it free and reached into the gap behind it. Her fingers touched paper. Slowly, she extracted a thin, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Edmund Beckett's handwriting. For the next 2 hours, sitting at the Hendersons' kitchen table, with coffee growing cold beside her, Sarah read Edmund Beckett's private journal. What she discovered was more horrifying than anything she had imagined. Edmund had indeed been shattered by his experiences in the war, but his response to trauma had taken a particularly sinister turn. He had become convinced that he and his family were contaminated, infected by the violence and suffering he had witnessed, and that only through extreme isolation and what he called purification through suffering could they be cleansed. But Edmund had not acted alone. Silas Cobb had found Edmund when he came through Ashford in the summer of 1867, and the two men had recognized something kindred in each other, a shared willingness to inflict suffering in pursuit of abstract ideas about purity and control. Cobb had his own history of brutality from his time as a Confederate officer, his own traumas that had warped into sadism. The journal documented their plan in chilling detail. They would seal the family in the cellar for 30 days, providing minimal food and water, breaking down their will and testing their endurance. Edmund wrote about this as if it were a scientific experiment, noting observations about his family's deteriorating physical and mental condition. His love for them, if it had ever truly existed, had been completely subsumed by his obsession. The final entries in the journal, dated mid-October 1867, just days before the disappearance, revealed that the experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. Catherine had fallen seriously ill. Little Emma had stopped eating. Thomas had somehow managed to loosen one of the iron rings from the wall and used it to attack Cobb, injuring him badly. Edmund wrote of chaos and breakdown, his careful plans dissolving into violence and panic. The last entry was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. "It has all fallen apart. Cobb is dead. Thomas killed him and I could not stop it. Catherine begs me to let them go, but I cannot. They have seen too much and know what we have done. There is no way forward but to complete what we started, to take us all to a place where we can be at peace. God forgive me." Sarah looked up from the journal, her hands shaking. The Hendersons watched her with worried expressions. "I think I know what happened," Sarah said quietly. "Edmund planned a murder-suicide. He couldn't face the consequences of what he had done to his family, what he and Cobb had done together. When Thomas killed Cobb in self-defense, Edmund realized it was all over. He couldn't keep them imprisoned forever, and he couldn't let them go to tell what had happened, so he decided to end it all. But Paul shook his head. "Then where are the bodies? This house has been searched multiple times over the years, by police, by treasure hunters, by previous owners. The property has been dug up looking for wells or graves. Nothing has ever been found. If Edmund killed his family and himself, where did he hide 5 bodies so well that no one has found them in over 150 years? Sarah realized he was right. The mystery was not just what happened to the Becketts, but where they had gone. Edmund's journal suggested his intention to take us all to a place where we can be at peace. What place? The farmhouse cellar had yielded no bodies. The surrounding woods had been thoroughly searched. The old well had been dragged. So where had Edmund taken his family for their final moments? Sarah thanked the Hendersons and drove back to Philadelphia as dusk fell, her mind working through possibilities. That night, she could not sleep. She kept thinking about Edmund's phrase, "a place where we can be at peace." She thought about his background as a surgeon, his methodical mind, his need for control even in death. And she remembered something from the property records, something she had noted but not fully considered. When Edmund purchased the farm, the property had included not just the house and barn, but also an old limestone quarry at the far edge of the land, nearly a mile back in the woods. The quarry had been abandoned decades before, considered worthless and dangerous due to flooding. The deeds mentioned that the previous owner had warned Edmund to fence it off, as it was partially filled with water and posed a drowning risk. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. A limestone quarry filled with water would be deep, cold, and if bodies were weighted down properly, they might never surface. Limestone's alkaline properties could even aid in decomposition, erasing evidence over time. If Edmund had taken his family there in the middle of the night, if he had ended their lives and sunk their bodies in that dark water, they might still be there, preserved in the cold depths, waiting for over a century and a half to be discovered. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Sarah contacted the state police and presented her findings. Edmund's journal, Catherine's diary, the evidence from the cellar, and her theory about the quarry. The investigation she set in motion would take months, involving cadaver dogs, diving teams, and ground-penetrating radar. But Sarah's research had finally given the Beckett family something they had been denied for so long: the possibility of being found, of having their suffering acknowledged, and of receiving proper burial and rest. As she returned to her studio to complete the restoration of the portrait, Sarah understood that the faces staring out at her were not just paint and canvas. They were the last deliberate record left by a family crying out to be seen, to be remembered, to have their captivity and suffering witnessed by a world that had forgotten them. The portrait was their testimony, and Sarah was determined to make sure it was finally heard. The search of the limestone quarry took place on a cold February morning in 2020. Sarah stood at the edge of what was now officially a crime scene, watching as state police divers prepared their equipment. The quarry was exactly as she had imagined it, a gaping wound in the earth, roughly 50 feet across, and filled with dark water that reflected the overcast sky like a mirror. Bare trees surrounded it, their branches forming a skeletal canopy overhead. The place felt simultaneously abandoned and watchful, as if it had been keeping its secrets for so long that it resented the intrusion. The chief investigator, a woman named Detective Rachel Morrison, had been initially skeptical of Sarah's theory, but Edmund's journal and the accumulating evidence from the farmhouse had convinced her to authorize the search. Multiple divers, Morrison said, standing beside Sarah and going over the operation plan. We'll work in a grid pattern, using metal detectors and side-scan sonar first to locate any anomalies on the bottom. The water is about 30 feet deep in the center, and visibility will be nearly zero. If there's anything down there, we'll find it. Sarah had brought the completed restoration of the Beckett family portrait to show Detective Morrison before the search began. The detective studied it carefully, her experienced eyes taking in the expressions of fear, the tear on young Emma's face, the tension in every line and shadow. "This is a document of a crime," Morrison said quietly. "These people were prisoners before they were victims. What Edmund and Cobb did to them, keeping them locked away, psychologically torturing them, that was a crime even by 1867 standards. The fact that no one intervened, that neighbors suspected but did nothing, that's its own kind of crime. It took the divers 3 hours to locate the first anomaly. Sarah watched as they surfaced, spoke briefly with Morrison, and dove again, carrying specialized equipment. When they emerged 15 minutes later, one of them was holding something, a corroded metal shape that had once been a padlock. They found it attached to a chain, the diver reported, weighted down with rocks. The chain is wrapped around something large, possibly a wooden crate or trunk. Sarah's heart hammered as she watched the recovery operation. A crane was brought in. Carefully lowered cables guided by the divers were attached to the submerged object. And slowly, with water streaming off its sides, a large wooden chest was hauled up from the depths. It was perhaps 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, made of heavy oak that had somehow survived its long submersion. More padlocks secured it, their rust-frozen hasps preventing it from being opened without cutting tools. When forensic technicians finally breached the chest, Detective Morrison ordered everyone except essential personnel to step back. Sarah, as the historical consultant and the person whose research had led to this discovery, was allowed to remain. The smell that emerged was not of rot. The cold water and sealed chest had created conditions that preserved rather than destroyed, but of damp earth, and something else, something that made Sarah's stomach turn. Inside the chest, arranged with terrible care, were 5 skeletons. The forensic team worked with painstaking slowness, photographing everything before anything was moved. But even from where Sarah stood, she could see that these were not just randomly placed bones. They had been positioned, a larger skeleton in the center, with 4 smaller ones arranged around it. The skeletal arms of the central figure reaching out as if to gather and protect the others. "That's Catherine," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She died trying to hold her children." Over the following weeks, forensic anthropology confirmed what Sarah already knew in her heart. The remains were those of Catherine Beckett, age 38, and her 3 children, Margaret 16, Thomas 14, and Emma 7. All showed signs of previous injuries consistent with physical abuse, healed fractures and bone damage that spoke of years of violence. But the cause of death was drowning. Edmund had placed his still-living family in that chest, sealed it, weighted it, and sunk it in the quarry, leaving them to die in darkness and terror as water slowly filled their prison. But where was Edmund himself? Sarah's theory about him being the unidentified man found near the Ohio border seemed increasingly likely. He had not died with his family. He had fled, perhaps overcome by what he had done, perhaps pursued by the guilt that Catherine's diary suggested he still possessed some capacity to feel. The severe beating he had suffered before his death suggested he might have confessed to someone what he had done, perhaps seeking punishment or absolution, and had met a violent end as a result. The search of the quarry turned up one more crucial piece of evidence: the body of Silas Cobb. His skeleton was found weighted down with chains on the opposite side of the quarry, a significant skull fracture consistent with being struck by a heavy object, exactly as Edmund's journal had described Thomas defending his family. Cobb had not been placed in a chest, but simply chained and sunk like garbage. Edmund's final contempt for his co-conspirator, evident even in death. The discovery of the Becket family's remains reopened a case that had been cold for over a century and a half. But more than that, it sparked a broader conversation about historical crimes, about the abuse that happened behind closed doors in the past, hidden by isolation and social norms that discouraged intervention in family affairs. Sarah found herself giving interviews to newspapers and historical journals, talking about how the Becket case illustrated the importance of recognizing warning signs of domestic violence and the terrible consequences of a community's failure to act. The restored portrait became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition about the Becket family tragedy. Sarah had completed her work on the painting, but she had made one crucial decision. She did not repaint Silas Cobb's figure back into the portrait. Instead, she created a detailed technical analysis showing where Cobb had stood, who he was, and his role in the family's suffering. The empty space where he had been erased became itself a powerful statement, a literal erasure of the abuser from the victim's memorial. But Sarah did add something to the exhibition. Using information from Catherine's diary and Edmund's journal, she created educational materials explaining the psychological manipulation and coercive control that Edmund had used to imprison his family. She consulted with domestic violence counselors and psychologists to develop content that would help modern viewers understand the dynamics of abuse and the difficulties victims face in seeking help or escaping. The portrait itself became a kind of shrine. Visitors to the exhibition often left flowers or notes in front of it, messages of sympathy for the Becket family and declarations of support for current victims of domestic violence. Sarah watched people stand before the painting, seeing Catherine's trapped scream, the children's frightened eyes, Edmund's desperate facade of control. The portrait spoke across the centuries, a testament to suffering but also to survival. Because even though the Beckets had died, their story had finally been told, their voices finally heard. 6 months after the discovery, the remains of Catherine, Margaret Thomas, and Emma Becket were buried together in the Ashford Town Cemetery. The entire town turned out for the funeral, an acknowledgement of the community's historical failure to save this family. A monument was erected, a simple stone marker with all 4 names and a quote from Catherine's diary. Let someone remember that we existed, that we loved each other, and that we deserved freedom. Sarah attended the funeral, standing at the back of the crowd, watching as the 4 caskets were lowered into the earth. Dorothy Walsh from the Historical Society spoke at the service, reading from Catherine's letters to her sister, the ones where she had tried to express her fear and her hope that somehow, someday, someone would understand what had happened to her family. The minister, a young woman far different from the Reverend Harding who had failed to help Edmund, spoke about bearing witness, about the moral obligation to see suffering and act to stop it, and about how silence in the face of abuse is its own kind of violence. After the service, Sarah walked through Ashford's small downtown. The town was trying to grapple with its dark history. The Historical Society had created a permanent exhibit about the Beckets. Local schools were using the case to teach students about recognizing abuse and the importance of speaking up. The town was not hiding from its past, but confronting it, using tragedy as a catalyst for education and change. Sarah thought about freedom as she walked, the word that had echoed through her research. The Beckets had been denied freedom, imprisoned by Edmund's madness and Cobb's sadism, trapped by social isolation and a community's unwillingness to intervene. Their loss of freedom had been total, physical, psychological, and ultimately fatal. But their story, once uncovered, had sparked a conversation about freedom's meaning and fragility. True freedom, Sarah had come to understand, was not just the absence of physical chains. It was the presence of a community that watched for danger, that intervened when someone was suffering, that did not look away from uncomfortable truths. It was the courage to speak up, like the child who had written that unsent letter to Sheriff Brennan begging for help. It was the persistence of people like herself, who refused to let victims be forgotten, who dug through archives and dirt to uncover buried truths. The Beckett family portrait hung now in the Ashford Historical Society as the centerpiece of a permanent exhibition. Sarah visited it one last time before returning to Philadelphia. She stood before the painting for a long time, looking into the faces she had come to know so well. Their expressions no longer seemed to plead or accuse. In death, their bodies had been found and properly laid to rest. Their story had been told. They had been freed in the only way left to them, from obscurity and from being forgotten. Sarah noticed something she had not seen before, or perhaps it was something that had only become visible now that the full story was known. In little Emma's painted eyes, behind the tears and fear, there was something else. Defiance, a spark of spirit that even Edmund's cruelty and Cobb's malice could not completely extinguish. It was that defiance that had allowed Thomas to fight back, that had given Margaret the courage to try to run away, that had enabled Catherine to keep her diary, creating a record of their suffering that would eventually lead to their discovery. That defiance was the heart of freedom. The refusal to be completely broken, the insistence on being seen and remembered as human beings who mattered. The Becketts had died in darkness and terror, but they had not died silently. They had left traces, messages carved in stone, journals hidden away, and finally a portrait that captured their suffering and bore witness across the years. Sarah understood that her work as a conservator had always been about more than just restoring paintings. It was about bringing hidden things to light, about revealing the truth beneath layers of obscurity and deliberate concealment. The Beckett family portrait had taught her that every artwork carried within it the possibility of testimony, that patient examination and careful research could give voice to the voiceless and bring justice, however delayed, to those who had been wronged. As she left Ashford for the last time, driving east toward Philadelphia through the early spring landscape, Sarah thought about all the other portraits hanging in museums and private collections, all the faces staring out from canvas, painted in different times and places. How many of them held similar secrets? How many families had suffered in silence, their pain captured by artists, but their stories never told? How many truths were waiting to be uncovered by someone patient and persistent enough to look beyond the surface? The Beckett case had changed Sarah. She approached her work differently now, always asking questions about the subjects of portraits, always researching the context in which they were painted, always looking for the stories behind the formal poses and practiced smiles. She had learned that art was not just aesthetic, but documentary, that paintings could be evidence, and that restoration was not just technical skill, but also historical detective work, and sometimes a form of justice. The portrait itself remained in Ashford, a permanent reminder to the town and to anyone who visited of what can happen when communities fail to protect their vulnerable members. But its image spread far beyond that small Pennsylvania town. Reproductions appeared in textbooks and articles about domestic violence, in historical studies of post-Civil War trauma, and in art history, courses examining how portraits can serve as social documents. And always, in every reproduction and exhibition, there was the educational context Sarah had insisted upon, the explanation of what had happened to the Becketts, the exploration of the social conditions that had allowed their abuse to continue unchecked, and the contemporary lessons about recognizing and stopping domestic violence. The portrait became a teaching tool, a way of connecting past and present, showing how the struggle for freedom from violence and oppression was timeless and ongoing. Sarah often thought about Detective Morrison's words when they had first looked at the restored portrait together. "This is a document of a crime. Yes, Sarah had come to believe, but it was more than that. It was a declaration that even in the darkest circumstances, even when freedom seemed impossible and hope was extinguished, some spark of humanity persisted. Catherine had continued to love and try to protect her children. Thomas had found the courage to fight back. Margaret had attempted escape. Even little Emma, dying in darkness, had been part of a family that refused to be forgotten. Their freedom had been stolen from them in life, but Sarah had helped restore it in death. Not by solving every mystery, not by bringing Edmund or Cobb to conventional justice, they had faced whatever final judgment awaited them long ago, but by ensuring that the Becketts were no longer lost, no longer just whispered rumors and local legend, but real people whose suffering was acknowledged, whose story was told, and whose lives mattered. The portrait remained a powerful image, those 5 faces staring out with their mixture of fear and defiance, their silent plea across time, finally answered. When visitors stood before it, they were not just looking at a family from 1867. They were witnessing a testament to the human spirit's resilience, to the importance of bearing witness to suffering, and to the fundamental truth that every person deserves freedom, safety, and the right to be seen and heard. Sarah's work on the Beckett family portrait won her professional recognition, awards from historical societies and art conservation organizations. But the letters she treasured most came from survivors of domestic violence who had seen the exhibition and found in the Beckett's story a reflection of their own experiences and perhaps inspiration for their own escape and recovery. These letters reminded Sarah why her work mattered, not just as art conservation, but as a form of advocacy, giving voice to those who had been silenced. Years later, when Sarah was asked to lecture about the Beckett case at conferences and universities, she always concluded with the same thought. History is not just dates and famous people. It is also the ordinary individuals who suffered in silence, whose stories were deliberately hidden or simply forgotten. Every document, every artifact, every portrait is a potential window into these hidden histories. Our job as historians, conservators, and citizens is to look through those windows, to bear witness to what we find there, and to ensure that the lessons of the past inform how we build a more just and free future. The Beckett family had been denied their freedom, but they had not been erased. Their faces stared out from the restored portrait, no longer trapped behind darkened varnish and deliberate obscuration, but clearly visible, demanding to be seen and remembered. In that visibility lay a kind of freedom, the freedom of truth, the liberation that comes from testimony and acknowledgement. And in the end, that was what the portrait meant to Sarah and to everyone who encountered it. Not just a tragic story from the past, but a call to action in the present. See the suffering around you. Speak up when others are silenced. Intervene when someone is trapped. Remember that freedom is not just a political concept, but a daily practice of recognizing the humanity and dignity of every person. The faces in the Beckett family portrait would stare out across time forever now, their message clear and urgent. They had lived in captivity, but died hoping that someday someone would understand what had happened to them. Sarah had answered that hope. She had freed them from obscurity, given them justice in the court of history, and ensured their suffering would serve a purpose, teaching future generations about the terrible cost of silence and the liberating power of truth.